Hi, Vanessa. Thank you for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, Ethan. Thanks so much for inviting me on. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you for joining me. So you came into the public eye really from your brilliant book, The Governor. Did you expect the book to do so well?
Look, I sort of class myself as a reluctant author. I didn't really want to write a book, but I had the opportunity. I happened to be helping a friend of mine write her book, and she wanted some technical stuff, and I was speaking to her for 3 or 4 hours with her ghostwriter. And afterwards, her ghostwriter said to me, "Oh, please let me do your story." And I was like, "No, no, I don't want to do it." And anyways, she was very persistent, Ruth Kelly, and she over the sort of next 6 months, she badgered me continually. And in the end, I kind of gave in and said yes on the condition that it's my story, it's true, and I have autonomy over it. We got on really well. She lives in Amsterdam. I live in Cambridgeshire. And so I had to go over there. She came over here. We spent hours talking, chatting, and then she'd write something up, send it to me, and I'd either give it a red tick or a red cross. So and that's how it was formed. And to be honest, I didn't think anybody'd be that interested in it. I thought, maybe one or two books would sell, but I never expected to be able to say that I'm a top 5 Sunday Times best-selling author. So
It is a
I'm very
brilliant
proud of that.
it is a brilliant book, and it gives you like an insight, obviously, into it. It is a fascinating career you've had, isn't it?
Well, people say that, Ethan, but to me, it was my job. I loved my job. I thought it was the right job for me. And looking back now, I kind of understand where the interest has come from. But at the time, it was my job. I loved my job. I mean, people used to say to me, when they found out what I did for a living, they used to say, "Oh, bet you could tell a few stories." And I always sort of gave them the knowing smile, but I didn't expect that I'd be writing it down for sure.
Well, this weekend you've been at CrimeCon in London. What was that experience like?
Well, I think it's the third or fourth time that I've done CrimeCon. Now, CrimeCon is really for true crime enthusiasts. But what I love about it is quite victim and survivor focused. So it's not about sensationalizing crime and sensationalizing criminals. It's more about understanding. There's a whole sort of group of podcasters who go, and there's Inside Justice, a charity that looks at wrongly convicted criminals and is run by volunteers, forensic scientists, criminal analysts, all this sort of thing. And so it's very wide and very varied, but it's not about sensationalizing crime or sensationalizing criminals. I love it.
I'd like to get into that later, actually, about the true crime aspect. But just to give us a bit of background, how did you end up working in the prison service?
Well, it's a bit. I kind of fell into it really. I started off when I left school with 1 or 2 ologies. I wasn't very good at school. I hated school, and I wanted to go into the forces. I wanted to go into the Wrens that was then, but unfortunately, I found out that the Wrens at that time weren't allowed on the ships. It was all sort of office work and shore based, and I wasn't interested in that. So I knocked that one on the head, and then I decided, well, I love animals, so I'll go and work with animals. So I went to agricultural college, got an HND in agriculture, and started working on a farm. And I did that for 3 or 4 years, and then I kind of I knew it wasn't the career that was going to take me through my life, because there was really, unless you own your own farm, you're always a farm worker. But I loved it. But I happened to be in London one day and saw this sign on a tube, and it said, "Your prison service needs you, and you too can make a difference." And I thought, I was a cocky 22-year-old and thought, oh, I can do that job. And so I applied. And at the same time, I applied to the Met Police. And when I was halfway through my prison service college training, I got a letter from the Met saying, we're delighted to tell you, please start at Hendon on such and such a date. And I thought, well, I'm here now. I'm halfway through. I'll see where it goes. And, one of those sliding door moments. I stayed, and 30 years later, we are where we are. So that's how I kind of fell into the prison service. But as soon as I walked through the gate of Holloway, I knew it was a job for me.
So, with them first few days at Holloway, did it take time for you to adapt to what was happening around you, and was it how you expected it to be?
It wasn't how I expected it to be, because Holloway was the old Holloway back in the day was a very old Gothic Victorian prison, and that was knocked down in about 1972, 73. And they built the new Holloway, which was based on a hospital, really, a mental hospital, because at that time they thought that women were mad and not bad. So it was all corridors like a hospital is, and rooms off these sort of blind corridors. It was quite difficult to work in. So, no, it wasn't how I expected it to be. I was used to seeing, Googie Withers on Within These Walls. You're probably far too young for that. But, cell block H with landings and things like that. But, I was surprised. And, of course, don't forget, I came from, a little village. I'd worked out in the sticks in the southwest of England for 4 years. I then moved up to London. The first night I was in London, I was given a quarter in Cricklewood, and I saw a bloke stabbed outside a fish and chip shop. So, it was a baptism of fire. So, and suddenly to be met by, 500 women who were very good at catcalling and that sort of thing. It was an experience. I never felt scared. I felt apprehensive, as anybody who starts a new job would. But I knew straight away that it was the job for me.
So at the start, what was a typical day like for you? And then as you got promotions and then eventually became governor, how did that change?
Obviously, the higher up you go the ladder, the more distant you become from the hands-on experience. But when I first started at Holloway back in 1986, the new staff were given the shittest jobs. My job was sewing rooms, and at that time, so the sewing rooms were. They used to sew the corners of sheets, put a little hem round a sheet. That was their job. And my job was to sit on a very high stool at the front and watch them all and count the scissors at the end of the session. It was boring as anything. And then, like, in 1991, I became a senior officer. And of course, then you're managing people as well as managing prisoners. So you start to get that sort of distance from the ground upwards, and doing details of staff and things like that. And then I moved to Scrubs in 2002. So I stayed at Holloway for 16 years. And then I moved to Wormwood Scrubs in 2002. And now that is a proper prison, what I call. You're met by the twin towers that are grade 2 star listed. You've got like a cutout of Queen Victoria on one side of them in sort of plaster, and Prince Albert on the other side. They're iconic. Anytime you ever see, some prison in the news, you can bet it's Wormwood Scrubs that they show. And I walked in there. That's a male jail, by the way. And I walked in there and I thought, yeah, now I'm in a proper prison, with landings and proper cell doors and great big keys with steel gates on and clanking and all that sort of thing. And so I was there probably 2 years, and then I became a principal officer. And then, sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time. And my boss left to go on to another job, and she was a governor grade, and they asked me to act up. And then, of course, you come out of uniform and you go into, your own clothes, and sort of the dilemma that causes is, well, what to wear for the next day, because usually it's just a white shirt, black trousers, and you're away. And then now suddenly I've got to have a whole new wardrobe that, people don't think I wear the same clothes every day. Again, it's another distance, but I always tried to, keep my hand in. I'd go onto the wings and chat to the staff, chat to prisoners, and then you become much more managerial. You have to attend meetings, which I always hated. I've got a resting bitch face, and people can easily tell when I'm bored to pieces. But I got through it. And then, as luck was had a bit, the job came up, and I went for it. Basically, I was told to go for it, and I went for it, and I got it. And then I became, and then my boss over me was another governor grade, what was called a governor 4 then, and she was the head of operations and security. And about, I'd say 9 months later, she retired. And again, I went for her job, and I was lucky, I was successful, and I got it. And I would have gone higher in the prison service, but because of the conditions of my pension, I would have lost all my pension rights if I'd have gone any higher. And in all fairness, I was quite happy to be the head of security and operations. My responsibilities were from the gate where people come in and out, from receptions, visits, the drug dogs, the mail, security, intelligence, all that sort of things. And, I really, really loved that more than anything. But I did still keep my hand in. I still went onto the landings. I still talked to the staff, talked to prisoners, because that's what the job is about, really. And I think it's important to be seen by staff and by prisoners, to be honest.
Well, like we said before, it's a fascinating and crazy career that you have had. And to you, like you say, it was just an everyday thing. But even like your first few, not long after starting at Holloway, sorry, you came across Myra Hindley, like
Yes.
notorious serial killer. And you didn't even recognise her, did you?
No, not at all. I mean, if you say Myra Hindley, everybody automatically thinks, the bleach blonde hair, the piercing eyes, that sort of thing. And, I at that time when I was a relatively new officer, and I said we used to get the shit jobs, part of my job was to transfer prisoners from Holloway, which covered at that time from Leicestershire right down to the Isle of Wight. So it was a vast area that it covered. And once prisoners were convicted, they were shipped out to convicted prisons only. And this one day, myself and two other officers, obviously I was the youngest, so I got to sit at the back of the van, which was the most uncomfortable. And we took a load of prisoners from Holloway down to Cookham Wood in Kent. And when we arrived there, we walked into receptions with the prisoners, and the officer that met us there offered us a cup of tea, as is normal practice when other staff come to your jails. And we all said yeah, because we were gagging. And suddenly from nowhere, this sort of, I hear this big shout, Myra, and out comes shuffling this oldish woman in a sort of denim skirt, in a brown cardi where the elbows had all worn through, and brown sort of mousy, a bit of grey hair, sort of, but down to here. And she asked us all what we wanted, and we all said. And then when she'd gone off, I asked one of the other officers, said to me, that was, and I was like, I've no idea, Myra, I guess. And she said, that was Myra Hindley. And I was like, yeah, right. And she said, no, that was Myra Hindley. And, I wouldn't have known her if I'd have tripped over her in the street. She worked in the receptions area. No, really, no other prisoners were particularly allowed near her. There were always staff about because obviously, what she did was horrendous crime, and she for her entire life in prison, she had a bounty on her head from one or another. And yeah, so she came back about 15 minutes later with a cup of tea, everybody. She gave us our tea. She asked us if we wanted anything else, and that was that. And, everybody asked me, well, did you drink the tea? And I was like, yeah, I was thirsty. Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, people ask about it, but it to me, it was just part and parcel of the job. These people who commit these horrendous crimes, they're nothing special. They're usually narcissistic psychopaths, and that's that. I don't have any feelings about them because I don't want to have any feelings, but I don't want to give them my brain space, to be honest. They're part of the job, and that is how you kind of deal with it. You compartmentalize a lot.
Did that kind of give you sort of a lesson that not to judge a book by its cover, like in the prison service? Because obviously you mentioned she didn't look like the Myra Hindley on them photos that you see.
Um, I think it kind of taught me that assumption is the mother of all fuck ups. I think that you can never assume in the prison service, and I pretty much think it was probably more that than the other, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Is that normal as well? Like someone like Myra Hindley, like working on a reception and going to make tea and stuff.
Well, look, obviously it would have been risk assessed because everything in the prison is risk assessed. And in all fairness, she was at Cookham Wood. She'd every so often they moved her off to another prison, so she never got her feet under the table too much because she was a prime manipulator. She manipulated an officer at Holloway to try and help her escape, and the officer ended up with 7 years. So you have to be very careful and mindful of manipulation and coercion by prisoners, but that is part and parcel of the job. And I think in today's prison service, I think that has gone by the by. There's not enough training, there's not enough continuous training, and there's not enough support.
She was at Holloway before you were there.
Yes, yeah, in the old Holloway.
Would you hear stories then, like passed down, like when you were working there about the old times and stuff?
Oh gosh, yeah, because there were a lot of officers when I first joined who joined in the early 70s. So they used to tell us all sorts about how when Myra got her nose broken by Josie O'Dwyer, and bled all over the place, and all sorts of things about how Pat Cairns was absolutely besotted with her, and nobody could understand why. And yeah, various people over the years have tried to get hold of Myra Hindley. Even Linda Calvey, who I was my wing cleaner 40 years ago, who's the Black Widow, was the original Black Widow, I hasten to add, who is now a very best-selling author. Give her a slap at Durham. So, there was always somebody there around the corner too. So she would never have just been left on her own with other prisoners. She always had staff around.
You mentioned there, like, you didn't realise it was Myra Hindley and there's no signs it was her. Did you ever get a bad feeling with any prisoners, though, that you knew there was... Obviously, they've done something wrong, but how extreme their crimes were and how evil they were?
Well, I think there are lots of different crimes that are evil in some way or another. Most crimes, for every crime that's committed, there are victims of those crimes. And I think that you can't help. We had a lot of child abusers in at Holloway. Just all of a sudden, it was a big paedophile ring that was brought in, and people, don't associate women with paedophiles. And for me, my personal opinion is we're supposed to be the nurturers, the carers, and how could you do that to any child, let alone your own child? And if you sit and think about all that sort of stuff, it can send you mad. You have to learn to compartmentalize. And we had a load of magistrates around once, and at that time we had a vulnerable prisoner unit where many of the paedophiles and child killers and that were. And I was happened to be working on that when these magistrates came round for a tour, which is normal. And one of them said to me, how do you work with these people? And I said, look, my job isn't judge and jury. That's already been done. They've been judged by their peers. They've been sentenced by a court. My job now is to keep them safe and secure and protect the public by not letting them out. And I always maintain that, no matter how horrendous the crime was. It doesn't mean to say, that I agreed with it or condoned it, because I certainly didn't. Prison was definitely the best place for them. But in order to work with these people and get them to accept responsibility for their actions, you need to converse with them in a professional way.
With somebody like Rose West, who you came across, she'd sit in a room and watch the news, wouldn't she, of her case? Do you think, you mentioned like the narcissistic, do you think she got a buzz off of that?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt, Rose West thought that, she was very quiet. She didn't cause a problem. If you asked her to do something, she did it. She used to come out. We used to get her out during the day when there were no prisoners about, to clean the landings and things like that. But you could always see with Rose West that the cogs were turning, and she would be how I would probably be, very polite to staff, face to face, but actually, watching, listening, working who she could sort of interact with the best, and things like that. So you really have to, with psychopaths, I mean, their trait is no emotion, and she certainly didn't have any emotion when myself and the duty governor told her that Fred had committed suicide one New Year's Day. She literally said, okay then, thank you. And I always thought that she thought that now Fred was dead, he would take the rap and she would get off. And thankfully, that wasn't the case, because the prosecution proved that she was equally responsible.
How much do you put that, like you mentioned there was no emotion when you told her that, how much do you put that down to like psychopathic like tendencies with emotions and stuff, and playing a game and thinking she's got away with it?
100%. I firmly believe that because Fred, even in his interviews, if you've watched any of the Fred and Rose programs, he says all along it was me, it wasn't Rose, it was me, it wasn't Rose. And they proved that it couldn't have been him, because at one time when she murdered one of her daughters, that he was in prison. So it had to be Rose. And I think she was a person that was quite often with those sorts of relationships of killers, it's the meeting of minds. Brady, Hindley, Fred and Rose, and I think they tend to spur each other on. And had she not met Fred or the other two, who knows? There might have not been the Moors murders or the Fred and West murders. I think psychopaths are always going to be psychopaths. You can't cure a psychopath. and to be honest, to protect the public, to protect um, others from having the same fate, prison is the best place for them.
You know, when Fred did die, he left her a letter. Would she have ever got that or not?
Oh yes, yeah, yeah. Once the coroner had finished with it, yes, she got the letter.
Really?
Yeah. Mm,
Gee.
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Did she ever mention him then, or not at all?
No, no, never at all.
Do you find
Never
that too
mentioned
bad?
him at all. I think her solicitor probably told her not to be very careful what she said around staff, and she was very.
You know what's scary, really, is how normal she looked, isn't it?
Oh yeah, but that is part of the traits of a psychopath. They walk amongst us, and you could have a normal conversation with her. People who are evil and killers, they don't have "I'm an evil killer" stamped on my forehead, on their forehead, and that's what makes them what they are, is because they do look normal. They don't stand out in a crowd. She could have been anybody's auntie, old Auntie Rose, and that's how the persona that she gave.
Do you think that's how she got away with it for so long as well?
um I don't know. I mean, I think at that time, it was early days of proper policing, and I think, that they were very lucky that, they got a tip off about a body in the garden, and that's kind of sometimes how crime started. I mean, I would imagine if they hadn't been caught, they'd have probably done a lot more.
Yeah, well, there's talk that there's a lot more bodies that never got
Mm.
found.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, she's got a whole life sentence. You'd think that, she'd be quite happy to spill the beans, but of course, that's another psychopathic trait, is to keep some information inside, to just give you sort of little drips and drabs every so often.
Well, you mentioned she's got a life sentence that she's obviously still serving. What will a typical day be like for her then?
Well, it depends what jail she's in, because the regime at various jails um, are different. So, I mean, it would all depend whether there were any credible threats. I read something, I don't know how true it is, but I read something in one of the papers the other day, how Joanna Dennehy, who is also a whole life sentence prisoner, plotted to attack Rose. I don't know how true it was. I'm very sort of mindful of the tabloid papers, but there may be some degree of truth in that, because Joanna Dennehy is an out and out killer and enjoys killing. And, so it depends what jail she's in, and it depends the regime that she's been risk assessed to do. But they'll certainly try and, make sure that she can do some job somewhere. I mean, I think she's now in her 60s or 70s, so she doesn't have to work now if she's past pension age. Prisoners past pension age don't have to work anymore. But her regime will be tightly controlled, and it will be risk assessed, and it will be deciding on whether there are any threats around her specifically.
You know, like we've mentioned Rose West, Myra Hindley, they're like the two most notorious British serial killers.
Mm.
The crimes are awful, but other people will have done as bad as crimes. But why do you think some are more like, I don't use the word famous, but more well known than others?
Well, I think with both Hindley and West, they're females, and I've just said, women are often carers, nurturers, child bearers, and we don't, as a society, we don't expect that from women, and often, with serial killers, it's the media and it's public outcry that drives the notoriety with people. So you have the likes of Ruda Cabana, the Southport murderer, you know, and the public were outraged. You have Abidi, Hasim Abidi, who, you know, was part of blowing up the Manchester Arena. And people are outraged at this, and the papers, the tabloids are outraged at this, and that drives the notoriety of these individuals. Same as Huntley as well. You know.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. With them two that you mentioned before, they've just did they attack a prison guard or something not long ago?
Yeah, well, both of them did actually. Abidi stabbed and threw boiling oil over 3 officers at Franklin Prison, which is a high security jail. And Ruda Cabana threw boiling water over an officer at Belmarsh Jail, another high security jail. And, you know, I think my personal opinion is that, you know, we appease these prisoners because, you know, everything a prisoner does is risk assessed. So somebody would have had to have signed off that risk assessment to say that Hashim Abidi could have unfettered access to a kitchen to cook his meals. He's serving 52 years, I think, or 55 years for blowing up 20 people, many of them children and mothers. And we're giving him unfettered access to a kitchen that includes oil and metal baking trays in which he fashioned knives. And, you know, all those staff had to protect them were white shirts. And I was absolutely outraged to read of that, because there are many prisoners, you know, category C prisoners who haven't murdered anybody, who've taken the wrong path, who would have loved to have cooked their own meals. Why are we giving somebody who's serving 55 years for what he did access to a kitchen to cook their own meals? It's beyond my comprehension. And I think appeasement of those types of prisoners, particularly terrorist prisoners who have a particular ideal about killing, maiming, wounding, whatever, is enough is enough. And we really, really need to knuckle down the management of these individuals. Personally, I'd like to see a kind of a supermax regime where they only come out for an hour a day. They're in handcuffs. They're escorted by 3 staff and another member of staff with a patrol dog. You know, they exercise on their own. They have very limited access to staff of any description, whether that be, you know, chaplain or uniform staff or non-uniform staff. And they have limited items in their cells. And everything that they have to earn. And because, you know, these individuals, they don't engage with staff. It's a bit like when we used to have the IRA prisoners, and they would just blank the staff completely. And it's very difficult to work with people like that. So if you want to engage, we'll let you have a bit more in your cell, maybe. If you don't, no, we won't. So that's what I think we should do. I also think I'm a good advocate for stab vests for staff. You know, I can remember maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a whole controversy because, you know, officers being assaulted is nothing new. The issue is who has done the assaulting, you know, the notorious prisoners. And we asked for stab vests then, and we were told that they were too intimidating. Now I go down to my local Tesco's, I see the security guard on the door now with a stab vest on. Doesn't intimidate me, doesn't stop me going and doing my shopping. But all those staff had, and it would certainly have saved. One staff member had boiling oil thrown over. One was stabbed 5 times in the back. It would certainly have stopped that. One was stabbed once in the lung and had his throat slit. Now, high neck stab vest would have stopped that. I don't agree with arms on wings, tasers, no. Any other firearms, no. And I firmly believe that most prison officers don't want that, because you're working in confined spaces. Average prison cell 6 foot by 8. Average landing probably 3 to 4 foot wide. You haven't got the space to give 15 foot for a taser to go off. 40% of the time tasers don't even work. You've got how it's the operator's fault, whether the person is high on drugs, whether they've got serious mental health issues, which many prisoners do, whether they can withstand the pain, and what happens if that prison officer is overpowered, and that taser is then threatened or used against members of staff, or be facilitated to used to facilitate an escape attempt. That's my thoughts.
Well, if anybody's got a right to have their thoughts, then assume it is you. So, but we mentioned CrimeCon, and you mentioned that was more like focused on victims and the victims' families. But true crime is a massive thing at the moment, obviously, with documentaries and things. How much is there a fine line between enjoying it and becoming too obsessed with it?
I think there's a fine line between being interested in it and sensationalizing it. And that's what I love about CrimeCon, because it focuses on what we can do better, how we can help stop, knife crime, how we can help with the psychological side of crime. And true crime enthusiasts they're not about sensationalizing crime and the macabre and the goriness. It's about understanding, because if you talk to many victims, I had the pleasure of speaking to Ray and Vi Donovan, whose son Christopher was attacked by a gang of youths and murdered, kicked to death, basically. And all they wanted to understand was why. Because in court, the three people that were found guilty of it were continually spouting their innocence, and not saying why. And so Ray and Vi started off a restorative justice, where as victims of crime, they wanted to speak to the people who murdered their son, and they did this, and it was quite mind blowing, because the first one walked in and said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't think of the consequences of my actions, and I didn't think that why the reason I was doing it. I don't understand why I did it myself." And that's all that Ray and Vi wanted to hear. And, they've done an awful lot of victim awareness courses, and for prisoners as well. They've been into other prisons, talked to prisoners, talked to primary schools. People like that, you just think, how do you do that? How do you have that strength within you to do that, to face your son's killers? And that's what CrimeCon is about. It's understanding crime rather than going into all of the gory details.
Another woman I wanted to talk about was Carol Richardson, part of the Guildford Four, that was in prison, but then turned out she was innocent. There's been a guy called Peter Sullivan who did 40 years. It turned out he was innocent. Is that very rare?
I think with the advance of DNA and profiling of blood spatter and all of those sorts of things, I think that is why these miscarriages of justice have come to the forefront. And I think that, I don't want the wrong person in prison. I want the right person in prison. And, I was talking earlier about Inside Justice, which is a charity that is run by volunteers, forensic scientists, analysts, that sort of thing, who take on cases of wrongful conviction and look at the evidence and then give it back to the Crown, with the hope of freeing the wrongly convicted and convicting the ones who haven't been convicted. So it's a very, very interesting charity, very worthwhile.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned you got transferred to Wormwood Scrubs, and you said that was a proper prison. But who are harder to work with, female prisoners or male prisoners?
Look, I agree with cross-sex postings. When I first joined, women work with women, men work with men. And then about 1987, 88, they introduced cross-sex postings where, women could work in a male jail and men could work in a female jail. And it produces a much more normal society, because that's what a prison is. It's a reflection of society. It's not all men, it's not all women. There is a mixture of the two. And quite often women in male jails bring a certain understanding and calmness. I mean, I've had prisoners stand in front of me and tell other prisoners, don't speak to the gov like that, at Scrubs. And, I've had them not open doors, but, say after you, gov, and all this sort of thing. So I am a firm believer. And look, women are a lot of women have been victims of abuse, sex trafficking, sex workers, drug mules. And often, as I've said, they're carers, they've got children, they've been abused mentally, physically, and they have many more emotional problems. They're prolific, and I mean prolific self-harmers. I've seen women try and pull their own eyes out. I've seen them take huge chunks out of their skin with their teeth. And I've seen men self-harm, don't get me wrong. There are men that self-harm, but not to the scale of women. And of course, as we're more emotional, women are quite likely to blow up much quicker. Whereas with men, you can tell when it's kind of simmering, it's not so spontaneous. I actually think men were much easier to work with.
When somebody does life, it don't necessarily mean they're going to be there the whole life. But what are the chances of them reoffending?
They're not that high, to be honest. I mean, obviously, look, you are going to get the odd one or two that do reoffend, because every time you let a prisoner out on license, there is a chance they're going to make a bad decision and end up back inside. But those that don't get whole life terms still get a life sentence. But they're given a tariff, and depending on what the crime was, is how big the tariff is. But that tariff is the minimum that they must serve. So if they've murdered somebody and they get a 25-year tariff, that is the minimum they can serve. That doesn't mean to say when they have, when they've served exactly 25 years, they're going to be let straight out. They've got to go before a parole board. They've got to prove that they're no longer a risk to the public. And sometimes that's very difficult for them to do. So they might not get that parole. It might be they do 32 years and be let out then. But they are on life license. So, they're let out on license once they're deemed not a threat to the public anymore. And they have to meet conditions of those licenses, whether that be to stay out of areas, not to contact various people, not to take drugs, not to drink. And being sort of drunk and disorderly in the street can get them back inside next day.
So following on from that, have you ever seen somebody close to being released and they do something and mess it up, and the sentence gets extended?
Um, well, no, not really, because the prison can't hold somebody, so that we can only hold them as to what the warrant says. So if the warrant says they serve 5 years and their release date is, I don't know, 3 years later on the 30th of June, then on the 30th of June, we have to release them. But if, say, they'd assaulted a member of staff and it went to the police could what's called gate arrest them. So on the 30th of June, as the door opens and they think they're going to freedom, the police are waiting outside to pick them up and arrest them on the assault charge. I've seen that happen, yeah.
We didn't mention before, but how crazy is it that we mentioned Myra Hindley and Rose West, like from two notorious couples, ended up actually having an affair? Is that common in prisons?
I think, well, to my mind, I mean, I think that's a fantastic combination. I mean, what a power struggle there. It didn't last very long, I'm reliably informed, but yeah, that was up at Durham. But look, as I said, women seek comfort from other women. And I'm not talking about sexual comfort. I'm just talking about comfort. And it does happen. Very, very rarely does it happen in the male jails.
Really?
There's not many prisoners that are openly gay in our prisons. There's not many male prison officers that are openly gay in the male estate. And that says something
for that.
Yeah, I think to a degree it's homophobia, and I think that it's very difficult for male prisoners to admit to. I mean, we did have one on the Lifer wing when I first went to Scrubs, and we used to call him Gloria. And he loved to be called Gloria, and he'd badger all the female staff for any sort of remnants of lipstick that they had. And he was openly gay. He was actually in for murdering his lover. So, but yeah, he stabbed him about 1,000 times or something because he cheated on him. So I mean, he was pretty safe because nobody was going to go near him. But it's a rarity rather than a normality.
Like you were a true professional. Obviously, you said like these people have been judged before they've come into prison. You don't want to judge them, but how hard is it to when you hear these crimes and stuff? Like, not obviously you have to treat them like human beings, but be so professional.
To me, if you can't be professional, then you're in the wrong job. Yeah. You have to work with these people. That's your job. And if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be in the job. I read some horrendous cases where when I worked on the Lifer wing, part of our job was every 6 months we had to write a report on the life sentence prisoner. And that entailed going through all the court records, all the pathology, all the evidence to write up on how this prisoner was doing, how he was addressing his crime, how he was settling down, was he working, all that sort of thing. So, some of them were horrendous. Every murder is horrendous in some form or another. Even I say a simple stabbing, and I don't mean that derogatory at all to anybody who's been stabbed, but that when you go through all the evidence and read all the evidence from the court papers, it's horrendous, full stop, no matter whether it's somebody being stabbed, somebody being kicked to death, or somebody being shot. It's all horrendous, and you have to learn to deal with that. And the easiest way to deal with that is to be professional and to compartmentalize it, learn to not take it home, learn not to think too deeply into it. I'm not saying it's easy, it's not, but it's part of your job.
You are dealing with a lot of different personalities, so would you have to treat some prisoners differently or talk to them differently?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think you have to find your own way of talking to prisoners anyways. Many prisoners are illiterate. 57% have the reading and writing skills of an 11-year-old. So you can't come out with big fat fancy words that they're not going to understand. So you have to find a level where prisoners can relate and understand you. And that comes with experience. Full stop, really.
And there are a lot of gangs in prisons then.
Yeah. Yes, I mean we had all sorts of gangs, more so in the male estate than the female estate. We had at one time we had the Chelsea Headhunters in. We had a couple of Muslim gangs in, um, Jamaican gangs, Nigerian gangs. And I think that they cause a real disruption to prison, and it's very difficult when you've only got sort of 170 prisons anyways, and out of those maybe only 50 are suitable, to try and mix these people up to where they can be safe and not collude, and you have to work on the fact that it's your main inference is your intelligence systems. You've got to have good intelligence systems so that if there is trouble brewing, that you are aware of it and can intervene.
So if you've got two gangs in the same prison, would it kick off a lot?
It doesn't usually kick off in 5 prisoners here and 5 prisoners here and they go like that. It's usually you find a prisoner in the showers with his beaten up, or you've somebody's had a razor blade sliced down their chin, or it's usually more an individual attack rather than a big clash of gangs like that.
Is that your goriest memory in prison then? What you start the book with the woman that got slashed?
Yeah, I think it was one of the many. I mean, I've seen prisoners who've had boiling water and sugar thrown over them, and of course, the sugar makes it stick to their face, and literally their just face falls away. Yeah, I mean, I think it. I think it was because it was probably women at that time, and we didn't have. I mean, we had fights and things like that, but we didn't have slashings. And I'd only been in the job like 2 years, something like that, 3 years maybe. So it was probably my first serious assault, and it's when you get it was all very surreal anyways. I thought I've got a murderer on my right, a murderer and an arsonist on my right, and a child abuser on my left, and looking back, it was very surreal.
Do they always mix then these different crowds? Or like I saw you book like say Rose West, for example, she'd be in the segregation bit, wouldn't she? For her own safety.
Not necessarily now. Listen, everything in jail is risk assessed. When she first came to Holloway, when I was in charge of the segregation unit, yes, she was down there because she was an unknown entity. She was high profile, in the media a lot. Her scalp would have been worth having for somebody. And to protect her and to protect others and to protect staff, she had to stay down in the segregation unit. But as time goes on and people change and the risk assessments are updated to see where she can be allowed, what she can do. So she wouldn't necessarily be segregated now, no.
So what I found crazy in your book is how prisoners would get drugs into the prison, like the guy with the fishing line. That was pretty
Yeah.
believable, wasn't it?
That was amazing, wasn't it? I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Never seen anything since. prisoners are ingenious. You know, they've got what we all haven't got. They've got time on their hands, you know, to think about how to get drugs in, mobile phones, chargers, etc., etc. And you know, a lot of drugs come in via visits. A lot of drugs come in via the courts. A lot of drugs come in via staff, all staff, not just prison officers. And you know, it's a constant battle. You know, as soon as you shut one door, another one opens. As soon as you take out one drug dealer, another one slips into his shoes. So it is because, you know, drugs, mobiles, they're big money in jails. You know, a little Nokia old thing that used to chase the snake on, probably worth £500-600 in a jail. You know, and a little bit of cannabis, probably worth £300. You know, it's usually worth 3 to 4 times what it's worth outside. So it's big money. We knew that there were prisoners who used to come in specifically to deal drugs. So they'd come in with drugs inside them, either swallowed or hidden elsewhere in other orifices, and come in for 3 or 4 weeks for breaking a shop window, deal their drugs, and then go off out. We knew that. We knew that that had happened. And you know, one of the things we had, you know, Wormwood Scrubs was in the middle of London. It had public path all the way around it, and it's very difficult to manage. We used to get, well, the ones we found, 30, 40 parcels coming over a day. I had a dead pigeon drop at my feet one day, walking around the wall, all sewn up, stuffed with drugs. We had tennis balls thrown over because obviously we had drugs dogs, and people would just think, oh, it's one of the drug dogs' tennis ball. You know, untold methods to come in. We found drugs in dirty nappies of visitors bringing their children in to see prisoners. You know, the list is endless. And you know, we had a really high mandatory drug rate. So 34-35% of prisoners had tested positive for drugs when I took over as the head of operations. And I came up with the idea of having the whole jail netted. And my deputy looked at me a little bit oddly when I discussed it with him the following morning. Said, I've had this idea about netting the jail. I said, I want you to find some way to net the jail with netting to stop the parcels coming over. Anyways, he did his job. We found a company to do it. We put a bid in, and it was the first one in the country, first jail to be netted. And we won the bid, and our drug rate went down to 5% over the course of 3 or 4 months. But of course, as soon as you do that, then of course prisoners turn their attention to staff, to manipulate staff, to coerce staff. So as I said, you know, one door shuts, another one opens, and it is a constant battle.
Yeah, like a cat and mouse chase constantly, isn't it?
Yeah, I used to say, they win one, we win two.
It's some of the stories though with the drugs where they were, and that is just really, it's disgusting, but it's crazy as well. Like,
yeah, but this is the thing, you know. Yes, it's bad, absolutely bad, and you know, those people that bring drugs into prison and drugs, mobiles, they have a huge destabilizing effect on a jail. You know, they cause violence, they cause bullying, they cause self-harm. They can be used, mobiles, to threaten witnesses to crimes, etc., etc. You know, the full force of the law should go against these people who are caught bringing drugs into prison. I don't think the prison sentences for bringing drugs or contraband into jails is high enough.
I agreed with the bit in your book actually where you said we should be more lenient on people caught with drugs, where it shouldn't like straight to prison. It should be like some sort of rehabilitation where they do 6 months, and then if they reoffend, then go to prison. Do you still agree with that?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of people in prison who shouldn't be there. We should, we have a lot of people with mental health issues in jail. We have drug addicts, alcoholics who've maybe broken a window or got arrested for sleeping in a doorway. And is prison the right place for them? No, I don't believe it is. I think much better use could be with substance misuse clinics outside and prisoners made to attend them. And absolutely, if they break the conditions of those community services, then they get prison. But I don't think we make enough use of them. Being a drug addict to me isn't a crime. Funding that drug habit is a crime, but there's a reason for that crime, and I don't think we do enough to stop people going to prison before. And then, you jail somebody for 6 months for nicking something out of Tesco's to go and buy some drugs with. In that 6 months, now they only do 40%. What can you do with that person in that short time? You can't. Drugs we know are in prison, so they're getting their drugs in prison. And when you let them out, they're probably homeless by now. If they work, they certainly aren't anymore. They've lost all the support services that they did have before they went in. And so we let them out to nothing. And then they get on the crime cycle and the merry-go-round of committing further crime. And I just don't believe that we've got it right. I'm not saying that, prison doesn't have a place in society, because it absolutely does. But there are some individuals, people with mental health issues, who would be far better served with strong support mental health systems in the community.
I know you mostly work with lifers, but what is the pettiest crime you've seen somebody arrested for that you thought they should really be in prison for that?
The pettiest crime was nicking a British Rail sandwich, and I think the guy got 14 weeks or something. He was homeless.
Yeah, stuff like that. It's not right, is it really?
No, but he did have the opportunity to have 3 meals a day. He did have the opportunity to have a shower, and we got him some new clothes. So, but come on, is that the what we think our prisons are for?
Yeah, after 14 weeks, when he got out, would he have had something in place to help him, or would he just straight out back into the upper world?
Well, I would have hoped that some hostel or something would have been found for him that he could have gone to. I mean, I don't know, because I didn't deal with his release, but I would have hoped that something had been found for him.
We were speaking about drugs before. The biggest drug story really involved your favourite inmate, Pete Doherty. What was that like, seeing it on the front page? Was it the Sun?
Yes, yeah. It was a photo of Pete Doherty smoking a joint with several other prisoners around him, taking photos of him with a mobile phone. And I kind of lost my shit a bit about him, because I didn't, to be honest, I didn't have a clue who he was when he came in. And I was the head of operations then. And obviously he's a high profile prisoner, apparently he was in some group and dating Kate Moss. And we knew he had a drug addict. That's why he was coming into prison, because he'd breached his conditions of his license. And so we decided, obviously we had a conflab to where best to put him, so we put him on our drug rehabilitation unit. Very limited places, 54 beds, so it wasn't a big unit. And they did a lot of good work up there, the staff, trying to help people get off drugs. And basically just took the piss out of it. Thought he was, all that and a bit more. He used to sign prisoners' cell cards. Outside every cell was a card which had their name and their number on it, and then they'd go missing. and then I walked into work one day, and on my desk was the tabloid paper with a Pete Doherty enjoying prison title or something. And I just had enough. I said, right, well, you can go down the seg now and stay there for the rest of the time in prison. And that's what we did. We went, myself and another officer went to his door, said, pack your stuff, you're coming down the seg now. You're clearly not willing to, you're clearly like taking up a bed from somebody who really does want to get off drugs. And you can go down the seg and wait your few weeks that you've got left out.
How much? I know obviously he's a celebrity and all that front page stuff is not good at all, but how much do you feel sorry for like the drug addicts, where there's so many drugs around in the prison, like you mentioned, that they can't get like. And if you want to, you've got to get off yourself, haven't you, for it to work? Like nobody else can do it for you, but when there's that temptation there around the prison, do you kind of feel sorry for them?
I don't think feeling sorry for them is probably the right expression. I understand the difficulties of it. You know, I was a smoker for many years, and you know, nicotine was very difficult to give up for me. And I think, you know, addiction, you've got to want to do it. You know, you can't tell somebody they're going to stop drinking or stop using drugs. They've got to put that 60-70% in, and you've got to help them with the rest. And you know, I think the much of the problem is the regimes that are now. I liken our prison service to warehousing prisoners now. You know, we're not helping them, we're warehousing them, and we're letting them out better criminals. So when you haven't got purposeful regime running, because we've got overcrowding, we've got shortages of staff, prisoners are locked up for much longer, you have to understand many of them turn to drugs to while away the hours, and that's not acceptable. That's not good enough.
No. So with somebody like Pete Doherty, who was a celebrity, would he have like not a target on his head, but would he be treated differently to a usual prisoner because he is a celebrity?
No,
would any
not at all. No, being a celebrity means jack shit in prison. Let me tell you, yes. Certainly when I was there, it did.
What about nowadays? Do you think it's still the same?
I've no idea, and I don't want to know, because if they are, I'd like to know why. You know, being a celebrity is nothing. What? Because you're in a band or you play a bit of music or whatever. You know, to me, they were a prisoner.
What about to other prisoners though?
Well, that's up. You know, it's not like he was a bit of a hero, particularly to the drug addicts on the drug rehab unit. You know, a bit of a rebel, and you know, that's how they treated him. You know.
Do you know like TV programs and films when they like this either shot in a prison or scenes in a prison? How accurate are them, and what are some of the biggest myths you've seen?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I struggle to watch those. Probably the best one that I've ever seen was Time, but even with that, you know, I thought Sean Bean played a blinding part, but the officer role wasn't accurate, because, you know, this principal officer, he had his son in prison, and you know, he went to a governor, told her he was being threatened, and she basically said, well, there's nothing I can do about it. Well, yeah, there is. There's a lot you could have done about it. And, you know, and then he ends up bringing drugs in, and I thought that was a poor ending. But I thought Sean Bean played a blinding role, particularly about you know, he was done for, was it dangerous driving, I think, and his first night in prison, and what it's like, you know, for prisoners who've never been to prison before.
You know, like
that was good.
I've not seen it actually. I've heard of it, but I'll have to watch it.
I'd watch it. It's good, but I was very disappointed with how they portrayed the prison officer. But Sean being played a blinder.
So you experienced a lot of things like every day is crazy for you, isn't it? Really, in prison. When you get home after a shift, how do you switch off?
Oh, that's a good question. I think probably watch some absolute shite on the TV, like Big Brother or something. Just something that you don't have to concentrate on, could just be a kind of noise in the background. Have a nice meal, maybe a glass of wine. Try not to sort of chew over the day's events. Hard. I don't say that it's not, and sometimes it's very hard. If you've had a really rough day, you've had a suicide or worse or whatever, and some it's very difficult to take that out of the jail and not let it go. So yeah, I mean it's not easy, but there are many other people that work in the emergency services, the police, nurses, doctors, surgeons, whatever, who have equally tough days, and you just have to learn to cope with it. Find your own coping mechanism.
Well, in your book, after you retired from the police force, you mentioned like you had panic attacks. It had an effect on your mental health. Do you think there should be more done about mental health in general in this country? But do you think there should be more for prison officers and people like yourself?
Yeah, look, I mean, when you think about prison officers or police officers or whoever, they see things on a daily basis most people don't see in a lifetime, thank God. And for me, the support services were never there enough. Like I said, we were expected to do these reports on lifers. We hadn't had any training. We never had any sort of pastoral care, whether we wanted to talk about it, or if we'd been in a suicide, we had a quick debrief afterwards. When I wrote the book, and like as I said, things are compartmentalized, and these things started to come out, and yeah, I did struggle. I struggled for probably about 18 months, and if I learned anything from writing the book, I'd probably say it's okay to not be okay. I think mental health has always been a taboo in this country, to speak openly about it, and now I'm quite happy to say, yeah, I did struggle. I struggled quite a lot, and thankfully that dark place has got a lot brighter. But there are many people much worse off than me, and mental health, I still don't feel we've got it right.
Yeah, definitely. There should be a lot more in place, but like you say, it's still not right, is it?
No, no.
But what's life like for you these days, though? Are you still baking?
I bake, but I don't work in the cafe anymore. COVID put stop to that.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, lost my job then. But in all fairness, I've got such a since writing the book, this whole world has opened up to me, which I'm very grateful for. Sitting with you, chatting, doing podcasts. I do a lot of media work, commenting on prisons. I've got a few pies in documentaries and things like that going on in the background at the moment. So, I'm very lucky. I'm out there, and if people know who I am and where they can find me now, and I've got a lot of good people connections in the media that have come about, and I really enjoy what I do now. I did think when I retired that I'd be out in a little small holding somewhere, feeding animals all day long and running around in me welly boots, but that's not to be just yet. So I really enjoy it. I'm very thankful, because when you retire after doing a job for so long, you kind of lose your way in society. It's, well, what do I do now? First off, it feels like holiday, and then this holiday just gets longer and longer and longer, and you start to think, well, what use have I got now? So it took me a while to get my head round being retired, but which is why one of the things that I discovered baking, and I went and worked in the cafe, in the kitchen, baking cakes, which I absolutely loved, and the two chefs in there were amazing.
Yeah, it did sound like you found yourself again in the book when you got the job there.
Yeah, I did. I did. I really enjoyed it. It taught me so much, particularly Andrew, who was the head pastry chef. He was just an amazing chef. Amazing to watch what he could just whiz up like that, and I learned so much. But I still bake now, but mainly just for family and friends. So, yeah.
Yeah, nice. Well, you're in your early 20s, weren't you, when you started the police service? If you went back in time, back to when you signed and started, would you do it all again? I know you had a lot of highs and lows in your career, but would you do it all again?
Absolutely. I had the pleasure to meet and work with some amazing people over the years. I met prisoners who came in with one attitude and went out and turned their lives around to become, part of society again. And there is no greater feeling when you think you've helped somebody do that. And to me, yeah, absolutely, I'd do it all again. There were highs, there were lows, but there is in any occupation. So.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I'll leave a link in the description to your books. It is a brilliant read. And
Thank you.
I'll also leave it. If you got any social media or anything where people can find you.
Yeah, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn.
Okay, nice one. Yeah, I'll leave some links below so people can find you and stuff. But thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
You take care now. Lovely to meet you.
You too. Thank you for your time.
It was a pleasure. Take
Bye.
care, Ethan.
You
Bye
too.
bye.
Bye. Bye.